From 2000 to 2004, Mike Danton played 87 games in the NHL. Two days after losing to the San Jose Sharks in the first round of the Stanley Cup playoffs, Danton was arrested at the San Jose International Airport for conspiracy to commit murder. What would eventually unravel was a twisted plot involving Hitman for hire, allegations of grooming and abuse, and ultimately confusion on who Danton was intending to take out. Prosecutors argued it was Danton's overpossessive agent, David Frost. Danton shocked the entire prosecution team when he conceded he indeed tried to hire Hitman, but insisted it was for his own father.
They'll show the grand jury they have wiretaps on you. And because I was at the apartment, they're going to try and say I was the victim, and I'm going to say the same thing I said that night. Right. I am behind you.
I know.
We all are. Okay, I love you, kid.
Love you too.
Bye.
Bye.
Danton's story begins in Brampton, Ontario, Canada, on October 21st, 1980, under the birth name Mike Jefferson. Mike was born to parents Sue and Steve Jefferson, with his younger brother Tom born shortly after. From an early age, Steve was known to be a loose cannon. Mike recounts a childhood marred by alcohol abuse, domestic abuse, animal abuse, and enduring what he would call abuse of all kinds from his father. In a 2014 interview with ESPN, Danton was pressed if this abuse extended to sexual abuse. Without breaking expression, Mike repeated without flinching,
"Abuse on all levels."
Although Steve Jefferson was indeed previously convicted of assault during Mike's childhood, he laughed off allegations of sexual abuse in the same 2014 interview. It was in this environment in which a 10-year-old Mike would first meet 23-year-old coach David Frost, recalling that Frost was cool, relaxed, and someone he looked up to, a likely solace from the turbulence at home. Mike was talented from a young age and quickly excelled in Pee Wee hockey despite the chaos engulfing him at home. Frost recalls that his first impressions of Michael was out of control, and it was clear that there was something going on at home. Frost lived just down the street from Michael, and it wasn't long until Michael would begin spending more nights at Frost than his own parents. As Frost recalls, he just had to get out of there, and in short time, Frost had progressed from far more than just a coach to the impressionable 16-year-old. It was ultimately Frost's influence over the Jeffersons that convinced him to sign off on Michael moving to Deseronto, Ontario, Canada during the fall of 1996. With a population of only 1,900 and a distance almost 3 hours away from home, the Jeffersons would place an unreasonable amount of trust on the shoulders of Frost, a young man who was just let go from his last coaching job for allegedly attempting to forge the GM signature and give alcohol to his 14-year-old players. The Quinty Hawks were likely one of the few teams who dare take on someone of Frost's reputation, playing in a division of junior A hockey playfully referred to as the Outlaw League. Although Frost claimed to have played high juniors himself, one former player claimed he couldn't even skate. The 16-year-old was set to be living in a motel, the Bayview Inn, with Frost and 3 of his Quinty Hawks teammates, all from Brampton. Sheldon Keefe, Larry Barron, and Darryl Tiveron. That same teammate, Sheldon Keefe, would go on to be drafted 47th overall by the Tampa Bay Lightning in 1999, and at the time of this video is currently the active head coach of the Toronto Maple Leafs. Michael's time in room 22 of the Bayview Inn consisted of a blur of underage drinking, sex, and partying, all while Frost hung around the background. Stories from that period claim that the hotel tried to crack down on the players by imposing a 10 p.m. curfew, only to have their visitors now climbing in through the second-story window. A 2012 piece from ESPN divulges an exchange between Frost and Steve Jefferson during this time that is enough to make your skin crawl. "Don't worry about Mike, he's having lots of sex." After Jefferson asked how he knew that, Frost replied with, "I'm right beside him." Other stories filtered out from that time continued to paint a grim portrait of life at the Bayview Inn. Elena Phillips, a retired nurse in town, claims that she gave Michael a place to sleep and fed him when she saw him come back from the inn, bruised and unable to speak. Another night, the Bayview Inn's owner reportedly saw Keefe sitting in the hallway sobbing, locked out of Frost's room and wearing only his underwear. Although they had their suspicions, no calls were ever made to the authorities. Eventually, word got back to parents on the team, and Deseronto Police Chief Norm Clark became involved. Clark asked the beaten-down head coach, Greg Royce, to assist in intervening with the Jeffersons and the Keefes, who seemed unwilling to waver in their support of Frost. According to the team's other assistant coach, John Boltby, when confronted with concerns surrounding the players' living environment, Steve Jefferson said, "You're not the one who knows hockey. Mind your own fucking business." Although by all accounts, the team was exciting to watch and rolled out one of the youngest starting lineups in junior hockey, the season would unravel when Frost lost his temper during a playoff game and slugged his roommate and player Darryl Tiveron in the jaw for being too soft. Not only did Frost do this on the bench in full display of the crowd, but town police were actually in attendance and would charge him with assault. The team would fizzle out of the playoffs, and Frost would be given a no jail time plea and suspended from coaching minor hockey. Frost's departure from coaching provided the perfect transition to becoming a full-time sports agent, with a roster of players already in the waiting. The OHL draft was just around the corner, and Mike found himself drafted to the Sarnia Sting, with Frost known to frequently attend games. During Mike's first season in the OHL, he found himself traded to the Toronto St. Michael's Majors, likely by way of Frost's design. It was said that during his time in Toronto, Frost would give hand signals to his players during games, with one GM calling him a lunatic. Mike's move to the majors would be more than just a step closer to home. It would be a reunion with three of the Quinty Four: Sheldon Keefe, Sean Cation, and Ryan Barnes. At this point, all four of these players were considered completely loyal to Frost, arguably above anyone else. The team had a reputation for playing an aggressive and grinding style, with fights about as common as goals. The Majors were associated with a private Catholic school, and their image on ice couldn't be a farther stretch. Off the ice, the Quinty Four were reportedly distant from the rest of the team and would be rarely seen without Frost. It was even said that Frost would wait outside of restaurants with his car running while the players were eating team dinners. The Majors organization seemed fed up with the Four and felt like Frost's influence over them was far too strong. It was these rumblings that motivated one of the strangest trades in OHL history, where the Majors sent all four players to Barrie in a 9-player trade, including the fiery Keefe, who is the league's current leader in goals despite being a rookie. four arrived in Barrie in January 1999 and brought the sideshow with them. National news first caught on to the presence of Frost when the National Post released an article in February 1999 detailing the mind games he would play with his players. That same article divulged the fact that Frost was technically only their advisor and worked for their actual agent, Mike Gillis, as the director of player personnel. The Quinty Four would make more than just a few waves. During a game against the Oshawa Generals on October 3, 1999, Barnes and Cation would collect 25 and 15-game suspensions respectively for their role in the stick-swinging incident. It seems Frost players had a habit of attracting trouble and lacked the discipline to avoid it. That Colts team was coached by a controversial figure in itself, a man by the name Bill Stewart. Stewart was known to host his press conferences in the hospitality area of the arena, with typically drunk and rowdy fans in attendance. One eye-catching moment from that season was when Stewart made the decision to stash their 17-year-old Ukrainian defenseman Vladimir Chernenko in the luggage bay of their team bus as they crossed the US border for an autumn road trip. Chernenko rarely played, and the move would ultimately be discovered, stripping Stewart of his GM title. In the midst of this chaos, Michael was still having a great season and was considered by Stewart to be the team's best player. His season would be derailed when he found himself serving a 10-game suspension for a brutal cross-check delivered to the face of an opposing player on the Mississauga Ice Dogs, reportedly scattering his teeth across the ice and continuing to punch the player after he had fallen. That same rambunctious Colts team would go on to win the OHL title against the Plymouth Whalers, with Coach Stewart deciding to decline attending away games during the series due to his recent border troubles. Before facing the Rimouski Oceanic in the Memorial Cup final, Mike would call their player Brad Richards overrated, just 2 days after he was named CHL Player of the Year. After the Colts ultimately lost 6-2, Keefe refused to shake the commissioner David Branch's hand, and Coach Stewart didn't show up to the post-game press conference. Four years later, Brad Richards would be a Stanley Cup champion, and Mike Danton would be awaiting charges for conspiracy to commit murder. One scout before the 2000 NHL draft reportedly discussed the results of Mike's pre-draft analysis with a sports psychologist and said they wanted nothing to do with him. It was claimed that the anger towards his family and association with Frost were two major red flags. Despite these question marks, the New Jersey Devils decided to draft Mike Jefferson 135th overall in the 5th round of the 2000 NHL draft. By this time, Frost had finally certified himself with the NHLPA as an agent, and his other client, Sheldon Keefe, was drafted 47th overall by the Tampa Bay Lightning in the previous year's draft. As the summer of 2000 came around, Mike reconnected with his 13-year-old younger brother, Tom Jefferson. Frost had rented a cottage outside the Kingston, Ontario area, and Mike wanted his brother to join him at the cottage for 2 weeks. After Tom came home from the cottage, he reportedly told his parents that he was tied up to a bed frame naked and had a gun pointed at him, all in the name of a supposed initiation ritual into Frost's group. Steve Jefferson would call the Ontario Provincial Police, and a brief investigation ensued. During that investigation, actual photo evidence of Tom duct taped to a bed in his underwear turned up and was being reviewed by the OPP and local child services. Police would interview Frost, Mike, and Keefe, and all parties maintained a consistent story that Tom was a willing participant in the initiation. The investigation ended there, and no charges were ever filed by the OPP. According to a 2012 article by the Toronto Sun, one of the investigating officers on the case called it the biggest injustice of his 31 years on the force, but refused to give his name for the story. When pressed for comment in 2012, the OPP said they were looking at this with interest, but nothing has developed further since. Mike started the 2000-2001 season with the Devils' AHL affiliate, the Albany River Rats, collecting 34 points in 195 penalty minutes, while also getting a small taste of the NHL through 2 games with the Devils. Despite being a pesky player on the ice, Mike's reputation off the ice had yet to truly sour in the eyes of Devils management. That was until the Devils' 2001 preseason training camp. After having a solid showing in his preseason appearances, he found himself injured and out indefinitely with a torn oblique muscle. Devils management made the choice to send Mike back to the minors to recover, yet there was only one problem. He just didn't go. Word leaked out that Mike had a second opinion on his injury and was advised by Frost to ignore the assignment. Devils GM Lou Lamoriello fired back and decided to suspend Mike for the rest of the 2001-2002 season. When asked about the decision in a January 2002 interview, Mike was quoted as saying, "I'm not drinking any more of Lou's Kool-Aid." In November 2001, the Devils paid him his owed bonus to retain his rights but didn't relent on the ongoing suspension. Mike filed a grievance with the NHLPA in April 2002, and the Devils eventually agreed to compensate back pay for his time away. From all accounts, Frost's influence over Mike had convinced him that he was an NHL player, and no less. Against all odds, Mike returned to the Devils' 2002 training camp with a new vigor and chip on his shoulder, in addition to a new name on the back of his jersey, Danton. Mike reportedly remembered it from a kid that attended one of Frost's hockey camp years back and claimed he just liked the name. Michael Jefferson would show up to the 2002 NHL season as Michael Sage Danton, describing the move to be motivated by the urge to separate himself from his family. Mike Danton actually had a strong showing out of preseason and earned himself a spot on the team's fourth line as an energy player, even scoring his first NHL goal during the second game of the season. However, after only 4 games in the season, GM Lou Lamoriello had to have a sit-down with Danton to settle his concerns about playing time, with Frost telling newspapers in a pseudo-threat that he hoped it was resolved with Lou and Mike before he had to get involved. "17 games into the 2002-2003 season, Coach Pat Burns agreed with management to send Danton to the minors. Danton again refused and was handed a suspension by management, with his future in New Jersey looking increasingly bleak. Frost savored the media circus surrounding Danton and supplied every news outlet he could with quotes. The Devils had enough of the Danton and Frost saga and traded him to the St. Louis Blues along with a third-rounder in exchange for a third-round pick. To any discerning eye, the Devils were making a lateral move to rid themselves of Danton. Danton arrived to the Blues training camp in 2003 and reportedly began asking his teammates of the necessary papers required to fire your agent. It's possible that Danton felt slighted by the handling of his career the last 2 years, after a 2002 New York Times article chronicling his suspension seemed to paint him as entitled and stubborn, and now doing so on a national scale. His Blues teammates also reported that Danton was rarely seen in the locker room without being on a cell phone with his agent, and that Danton would only be spotted with Frost before and after games. Danton's maturity failed to develop with a change of scenery, and when he faced the Devils for the first time in January 2004, that was on full display. He made a point of sending a puck to the Devils' dressing room before the game, which was in fact the same puck that Danton scored his first career NHL goal with. while wearing a Devils jersey. Meanwhile, during the 2003-2004 season, a turn of fate would find Frost's other client, Sheldon Keefe, the owner of the Pembroke Lumber Kings, a junior A team playing just north of Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. It was also discovered that despite the indefinite suspension on his ability to coach junior hockey, Frost had served as an assistant coach for 3 games. Mike was a 23-year-old professional athlete with $500K in his bank account and a penchant for binge drinking and strip clubs. As Danton described in a 2011 interview with Sports Illustrated, "I couldn't make decisions. I was a 23-year-old infant who wasn't in the right mind frame to be an adult, much less an NHL player." It would be late in the 2003-2004 season that Danton would meet a tall, blonde rink employee working at the St. Louis Blues practice facility by the name of Katie Wolfmeyer. Danton's reputation of a party boy was widely known, but it wasn't long until the 19-year-old community college volleyball player was reportedly smitten. Despite his reputation, the soft-spoken Canadian was known to be a charmer and was called by some the nicest guy on the team. His bond with Wolfmeyer would be strengthened when he broke down and filled her in on a burden that had been weighing on him heavily. Danton told Wolfmeyer that he was living in St. Louis in fear and that someone from Canada was coming to kill him. Wolfmeyer must have been wholly convinced in Danton because on April 14, 2002, things started to become undeniably real. While in a car with several friends, she asked anybody if they knew someone who would do something for a friend, not knowing that one of the passengers she had met that morning was part-time police dispatcher and former police intern Justin Levi Jones. Katie handed Jones the phone, and Danton allegedly offered Jones $10,000 to kill the Canadian Hitman. Jones had no idea what he had got himself into, but he said he needed more details, and gave Danton his number. At 12:02 a.m. on April 15, 2004, Danton placed a call to Jones, who happened to be recording the call at the time. Danton detailed a plan in which Jones would take Wolfmeyer to his apartment, and the two would create a scene in which it appeared there had been a robbery, and an argument between the two robbers resulting in one being fatally shot. Jones realized that Danton was serious when he kept pushing for the job to be done that night, relaying to Jones, "I'm pretty much begging. I wouldn't resort to this if it wasn't a matter of life and death." Jones ended the call with Danton that evening and was so spooked he decided to contact the FBI and fill them in on Danton's plan. The FBI instructed Jones to go along with the plot as to not raise any suspicion that there was a developing investigation, and that Jones was to proceed with picking up Wolfmeyer that evening. The two had arranged to meet at a Denny's parking lot at 10 p.m., although Jones gave her a call at 10:15 to let her know that he was running late. By 10:30 p.m., the two were headed in the direction of Danton's townhouse-style apartment in the upscale neighborhood of Brentwood, St. Louis. Jones spoke to the security guard of the gated community that they were there to see Mike Danton, who they knew would be in San Jose at the time in the midst of a playoff series. After the guard called Danton's apartment, a chubby man in his mid-30s appeared at the second-floor railing. Frost yelled down to the approaching figure and asked who he was. Jones panicked and gave a fake name to Frost, likely not expecting him to be staying at Danton's unit. When Frost claimed he was Mike's dad, Jones drove away in a hurry. The interaction must have unsettled both parties, as Frost decided to call his client in San Jose immediately after. By all accounts of that phone call, Mike broke down and told Frost of the plan he had hatched to hire a hitman, word that Frost was going to leave him. At this point, Frost decided to phone the police and fill them in on the plot against his life. He reportedly told authorities that he had known Danton for years. Danton gave him a key to his apartment, and that Danton begged him not to go to blues management and ruin his career, and that he had threatened to leave him. Likely sensing his plan collapsing on himself, Danton placed another call to Jones to try and establish an alibi for the two visiting Danton's apartment, reasoning that Jones was there to accompany Wolfmeyer to her boyfriend's apartment because she was scared of going alone, and that he had never met Danton. "This is the only way we can get out of this," Danton reasoned. By this point in time, it was all too late for Danton, and the walls began to close in. FBI agents arrested Wolfmeyer at 12:30 a.m. on April 16, 2004, and intercepted 3 messages from Danton to Wolfmeyer, instructing her on what to say to the authorities. Curiously enough, federal agents received written consent from Danton's father to conduct a search of Mike's apartment. Undoubtedly, this was Frost's work, based on the history of calling himself Danton's father instead of agent. Just as the alleged gunman would claim, inside Danton's unit they found $3,000 in an unlocked safe, intended to be the down payment for the job. Agents had more than enough evidence to make an arrest, and as Danton was traveling home from San Jose, they made their move. As the case headed to trial, more details emerged that made the judge responsible for handling the matter say it was one of the most bizarre cases he has ever seen. Canadian papers ran tabloid headlines like NHLer charged in gay slave plot, and it was clear that the media had attached themselves to the Danton saga for the foreseeable future. On May 21, 2004, FBI agents conducted an interview with Danton's roommate on road trips, blues center Ryan Johnson, who described the relationship between Frost and Danton to be strange and bizarre. FBI investigators also interviewed 2 witnesses who claimed that Danton had approached them 6 months prior in an attempt to hire someone to kill Frost, with one witness the bouncer of an East St. Louis strip club that Mike frequented. To the surprise of no one, Frost didn't shy away from the spotlight and embraced the newfound media attention. Frost even went so far to claim that Mike's actions were likely motivated by an unconfirmed diagnosis of bipolar disorder. Big Mike and Little Mike. Big Mike can function in a lot of situations, but he reverts to Little Mike, emotionally needy, helpless when he's alone. It's when he's Little Mike that he has his problems. Mike is delusional. He sees things that aren't there, claimed Frost. Frost recalls an instance with Danton where on the way home from the arena after a game, he was driving erratically and taking side streets in an attempt to shake his father from following him, although Frost claims his dad had never came down to St. Louis. Reading articles from that time are increasingly odd, as sources had not realized at this point that the acquaintance who Danton was intending to kill was the very same agent of his being quoted later in the article. Danton was facing up to 10 years of prison and a $250,000 fine on each 2 counts that he conspired and used a telephone across state lines to set up a murder. For her role in the plan and knowingly taking a suspected hitman to Danton's apartment, Wolfmeyer was also charged on the same 2 counts. The media scrambled to get quotes from Danton's teammates, from junior and NHL alike. 2 of Danton's NHL teammates, Doug Waite and Scott Mellenby, would even attend one of Danton's preliminary hearings in May 2004 to observe and support Mike. While Danton was in custody, he would issue a statement denouncing his family and the constant physical and emotional abuse he endured growing up, while thanking Frost directly and the Blues organization for the ongoing support. What also eventually leaked out was the incredibly fragile state of mind that Danton was in during this time, after it was revealed that he was dealing with a nagging shoulder injury and actively on a painkiller named Toradol, and directly said to federal agents, "I can't go on, I can't do this anymore, I am sick in the head." Shortly after, Danton would attempt suicide. It was suspected that a gag order was implemented because of the clear influence that Frost had over Danton, with his recent statement from jail seeming to be a script handed to him by his agent. This did not stop Frost from continuing his media tour across North America, and it was during an interview with a Toronto radio station on Tuesday, May 18, 2004, that Frost revealed a detail no one else had suggested to this point. The intended victim was Mike's dad. When the case was brought to court, the judge listened through to 3 out of 79 recorded phone conversations between Danton and Frost, where Frost seemingly pushed Danton into an insanity defense. "It's not an option to go to court. If we go to court, you are done. Are we clear?" One of the stranger developments from the series of phone calls was the coded language that Frost and Danton attempted to use, aware of the fact that their calls were being recorded. It seems that Frost had taken to referring himself as that Nat guy, or the Young Nats coach, a nod to his previous time as Mike's coach with the Toronto Young Nationals. Additionally, it seemed as if Frost was using the name Pascal as a code for money, with statements like, "My young Nat coach, I owe him Pascal and I want you to take care of him." Pascal Riome was a former teammate of Danton's and number 25, a likely implication that Frost was looking to receive $25,000 from Danton. In that same phone call, Frost seemingly presses for reasons why Danton wanted him killed, saying, "God, you must have wanted that Nat guy gone, huh? Did you?" To which Mike meekly replied, "No," after a long pause. FBI agents speculated that the potential $25K was another part of Danton's motive in the murder conspiracy. Dropping any semblance of cover, Danton at one point literally says, "We can't be talking in code like this because I'm not catching this. In addition to this isn't working, Dave. We've got to find something else. I'm not catching you, so you've got to find something different." Katie Wolfmeyer would be the first to go on trial for the case in September 2004, with Danton refusing to testify on her behalf. Despite his refusal, Wolfmeyer was ultimately acquitted on all charges and would tell media sources that she felt pity for Danton and how quickly his life had been ruined. After all was said and done, Danton would agree to a plea deal in an attempt to reduce his sentence and the odds of accumulating additional charges throughout the process, like obstruction of justice. Danton's 7 months in jail throughout the proceedings nullified the $250,000 fine attached to the sentence, but he would still be handed a 7.5-year term in U.S. federal prison. To the dismay of the feasting media circus, Danton's plea deal included a stipulation that allowed him to avoid going any further into the actual intended victim of the crime, although years later, he'd be more than ready to share while not under oath. Two years into Danton's sentence, he began working with a new attorney, Howard Kiefer, with the intention of appealing and potentially overturning his conviction. Unfortunately for Danton, his appeal was likely doomed from the start. Following Danton's failed appeal, it was discovered that Kiefer did not have a license to practice law and had never graduated from the law school he claimed he attended. In addition to posing as a lawyer, he had a shady past of tax fraud, forgery, and grand theft, dating as far back as 1990. Just 1 week after CBC aired an episode of the investigative journalism series The Fifth Estate, focusing on Frost and Danton, Frost officially resigned from the NHLPA as a player agent. He followed up this move by telling newspapers in April 2006 that he was retiring from hockey altogether, but it's possible that he had a sense of the firestorm coming his way in just a few mere months. After years of countless rumors, Frost was officially charged by the Ontario Provincial Police for 7 counts of sexual interference involving minors and a single count of assault dating back to his Deseronto days. According to the OPP, the investigation was pursued in April 2004 following Danton's arrest and took nearly 2 years to complete. After nearly 7 months of the proceedings being delayed, Frost had 6 charges dropped by the Crown due to insufficient evidence. All claims were related to female victims 14 to 16 years old and would have required one of the Quinty Four to testify against Frost to likely produce a guilty conviction. The extra attention surrounding Frost resulted in another criminal charge surfacing, this time a credit card fraud charge for a $90 purchase when Frost decided to use Danton's card to pay for gas just outside Kingston, Ontario. Although Frost would beat the charges by insisting he had Danton's permission, it raised a few worrying questions. How was Frost communicating with Danton despite the non-contact rule in place between the two? And additionally, isn't there some conflict of interest with Frost having Danton's power of attorney? Meanwhile, Frost's trial for sexual exploitation charges will continue in October 2008 after originally being arrested back in August 2006. Unsettling details leaked of Frost's alleged participation in threesomes with Danton and his underage girlfriend, and his desire to control when the couple would have sex. In the midst of Frost's legal troubles, Danton finally won a long-fought battle to gain transfer to a Canadian prison during March 2009. Based on the leniency of the Canadian system, Danton was now eligible for full parole and out of jail by September 2009, with conditions that required him to avoid contact with both his father, Steve Jefferson, and his ex-agent, Dave Frost. Danton's parole hearing was highlighted by a new revelation that the intended victim for his crime in 2004 was not his mentor and father figure David Frost, but it was his abusive biological father, Steve Jefferson. He even gave an hour-long interview with Nick Kyprios on the TV network Sportsnet, where he stuck to that same story. Despite Danton's claims, too many details pointed towards Frost being the real target. Namely, the fact that he sent the hitman to his own apartment in full knowledge Frost was staying over. Additionally, CBC's The Fifth Estate confirmed that Danton showed his would-be hitman a picture of Frost during the planning stages of the murder. Upon Danton's release from prison, it wasn't long before he found himself back on the ice, but this time it was at the Canadian University level with the St. Mary's Huskies, pursuing a double major in psychology and criminology. The school's location in Eastern Canada provided solace from the hounding Toronto media, and afforded Danton a second chance at a normal life. By all accounts, he was a kind and active student on campus. Frost would move his family to California after the trial in an attempt to avoid the scrutiny of the Canadian media, living under the assumed name of Jim McCauley, using his wife's maiden name as a cover. Frost had weaseled himself into a position of running a hockey academy in Laguna Niguel, California, and had full access to an entire new crop of young hockey players. Despite his true identity being discovered, Frost kept his position until 2013, when the academy was no longer welcome at the property they were renting. Danton left after a national championship in 2010 and embarked on a career overseas in Europe, making stops in Sweden, Kazakhstan, Poland, and Austria. Although he wasn't making any headlines for his play on the ice, Danton happened to use his prison experience for good as he managed to save the life of a convulsing teammate. Danton remained modest in any interviews, stating he was just happy to be back on the ice and to be part of a team again. Earning his degree from St. Mary's in 2016, Danton is now raising 3 children with his wife Nancy and running his own hockey academy out of Halifax. When asked about his past, he is never one to shy away from it and will openly admit the depths he had fallen to. The only dark spot that remains is his relationship with Frost, a man who he has been legally barred from making face-to-face contact with, but still refers to him as a surrogate father. Frost's whereabouts remain a mystery to those outside his inner circle, but his legacy does not. In closing, I will leave you with one of Frost's quotes from his 2008 interview with ESPN magazine. "I've been accused of being a manipulator. But what are Scotty Bowman and Pat Burns and Mike Keenan? They're all manipulators. That's what a good coach is supposed to do."